A military confrontation between the United States of America and Russia has become quite likely in the near future, and you won't believe the reason why? Russia is preparing to send oil and petroleum products to Cuba, which is suffering from a fuel crisis. This shipment is planned in the near future as humanitarian aid to Cuba, but this means that Russia will try to break through the blockade of the United States of America, and this could lead to a potential confrontation with American warships. Such a statement from the Kremlin came amid threats from United States President Donald Trump to impose additional tariffs against countries that try in any way to supply Cuba with fuel or oil. But it should be noted that the situation in Cuba is truly catastrophic. We talked about this with you in the previous episode. But now it has become known that even Russian airlines, which were flying to the island until the very last moment, have cancelled all flights to Cuba because there is no fuel there. And the authorities in Havana announced that they have nothing to refuel the planes with. At the same time, Putin and Lukashenko decided not to fly to the United States of America for the first ceremonial meeting of Donald Trump's peace Council. And they claim that no, they are not afraid, it's just that their schedules don't match up. And Trump invited the two dictators to this peace council too late. They already had plans. My name is Alexi Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, leave any comment under this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as it comes in. So, Russia is trying to break the blockade of Cuba by the United States of America. Russia is preparing to send oil and petroleum products to Cuba, which is suffering from a fuel crisis. This was reported by the embassy of the Russian Federation in Havana. Diplomats from Moscow clarified that the delivery is planned in the near future as humanitarian aid, but the volume of such a delivery is not being disclosed. The statement was made against the backdrop of threats by United States President Donald Trump to impose additional tariffs against countries that attempt to supply Cuba with fuel. And let me remind you, Trump, by the way, never actually imposed any tariffs against Russia, citing the fact that trade between these two countries is already at a minimum. The Republic of Cuba, I should note, has not received any oil from abroad for a month now, and its own reserves have been almost completely depleted. And at the end of January, the KPLR agency calculated that Cuba would be able to last no more than 20 days without fuel imports. The last batch of oil arrived on January 9 from Mexico, which froze exports after threats from Donald Trump. Venezuela, which was the second main supplier of oil to Cuba, stopped shipments after January 3 when American special forces captured its leader, Nicolas Maduro. The last major shipment of Russian oil to Cuba took place in February of last year. At that time, 700,000 barrels were sent, and these 700,000 barrels were provided as a government loan of $60 million personally allocated by the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. If the Kremlin supplies the same amount of oil now, without a strict austerity regime, it will last for 20 days. Taking into account that in 2025, Cuba was purchasing an average of 37,000 barrels. But it's important to note here that sending oil to Cuba could result in economic and political costs for Russia, because any support for Cuba risks worsening relations with the United States of America. Moreover, they might try to detain Russian tankers just like they did with the Mariner ship that was transporting Venezuelan oil. In other words, the Americans have already made it clear that they are ready to seize any tankers operating in the Western Hemisphere that violate the decrees and laws passed in Washington. And this could lead to a military confrontation if the Russians decide to escort the tankers with ships from the Russian Navy. Now imagine a situation where the Kremlin wants to break through this blockade. Cuba says, we don't care about Donald Trump. We will send our own oil tankers straight to Havana. Let the Russians receive humanitarian aid. They might try to disguise it, saying, well, this is humanitarian aid. You can't seize this tanker. But then how will Donald Trump look, who said he was ready to counter any shipments? If he allows the tanker through, the Americans will likely stop it. It will be interesting to see Russia's response. And this is exactly where the risk of an uncontrollable provocation arises. Let me remind you, at the beginning of February, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, following negotiations with his Cuban counterpart, stated that Moscow is ready to support Havana financially. But here's the question: what will Cuba do with this money if it can't buy anything on the external market because of that very blockade? And by the way, I recommend you watch my previous episode about Cuba to really understand the full scale of the disaster. The head of the Russian Foreign Ministry emphasized that Russia considers the actions of the United States in Azerbaijan unacceptable, including the blockade of oil supplies to the island, which threatens a serious deterioration of the economic and humanitarian situation in the country. The Kremlin has called Trump's measures against Cuba strangling tactics and described the fuel situation on the island as critical. Here, I would like to remind Russians how they cut off gas in Ukraine. How could that be called? Was that a violation? Was that a strangling tactic or not? So before opening their filthy mouths, Russians should remember their own history. And then? The press secretary of the Russian president, Dmitry Peskov, said that Moscow is considering the possibility of providing, as he put it, feasible assistance. And let me also remind Russians that in 2014, Vladimir Putin already wrote off 90% of Cuba's debt, namely $32 billion, and will continue trying to help Cuba. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians, what are they doing right raising taxes? But to assess the scale of the catastrophe on the island, it's worth paying attention to another telling point. The airlines Rossiya and Nordwind are stopping flights to Cuba due to difficulties refueling planes caused by a fuel shortage on the island. Here is the official announcement. This is an interesting point about Aeroflot, which actually owns these two Russian airlines. The airlines clarified that to bring Russians back from Cuba, the company will send 6 more flights from Havana to Moscow and 1 flight from Moscow to Havana to take foreigners from Russia to Cuba, and after that there will be no more flights. Let me remind you that since February 10, foreign planes are no longer refueled at Cuba's international airports. The Cuban authorities, of course, blame the United States of America for the fuel crisis. Let me remind you, on January 29, American President Donald Trump called Cuba an extraordinary threat to United States national security and threatened additional tariffs on countries that try to deliver oil there. As a result, Cuba was left without oil. And in this light, it's worth mentioning another telling piece of news that the two aging dictators Lukashenko and Putin will miss. The first meeting of Cuba is of the organization called the Council of Peace, which was established by American President Donald Trump. This event will take place on February 19th at the White House, but Lukashenko and Putin, of course, are afraid to travel to the West. It's funny that Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, stated that there is no trip to the United States in President Vladimir Putin's schedule in the near future. In turn, Lukashenko's press secretary Natalia Eisman noted that the invitation to the first meeting of the leaders of the Peace Council came very late. President Lukashenko's work schedule for this period had already been planned. Well, listen, Alexander Lukashenko is so busy that Donald Trump just missed his chance with his invitation to come to Washington. The Belarusian dictator doesn't have time for some American president. Although, Eisman still had the guts to say, and I quote, "There may be logistical difficulties due to the sanctions against Lukashenko. That's the real reason. Instead of the president, Belarus will be represented at the organization's first meeting by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, Maxim Ryzhenkov." And let me remind you here that Trump decided to create a peace council under his leadership to manage the Gaza Strip after the end of military operations there. At the same time, the organization's charter describes broader powers. In particular, it is presented as an international organization aimed at promoting lasting peace in regions affected by conflicts. The Trump administration sees the Peace Council as a potential replacement for the United Nations and plans to use it to monitor compliance with a future agreement to end Russia's war against Ukraine. And it is assumed that the first 3 years of participation in the organization will be free of charge. But if a country donates $1 billion, it will be able to maintain its membership after that period. By the way, Vladimir Putin stated at the end of January that Moscow is ready to send that very $1 billion from the Russian assets frozen in the West to the Peace Council. At the same time, in February, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov noted that the Russian authorities have not yet developed a position regarding Donald Trump's organization, since many countries in the West and in the East, quote, will treat it with caution. But Lavrov, Putin, Peskov, and all the others didn't have the courage to say that their bald boss is simply despised in the West and Putin is just too scared to travel anywhere. And not all these stories about how, Putin and Lukashenko have such a busy schedule that they, unfortunately, have to miss the summit in Washington. Well, that just sounds ridiculous. I'm just curious, who do they think Russians and Belarusians are in the Kremlin and in Minsk when they say things like that? And I'm really curious, do Russians and Belarusians actually believe this nonsense? Do they really believe that Lukashenko has such a busy schedule that he even turned down the peace summit led by Donald Trump? Well, that's nonsense, complete nonsense. But let's see how the story ends with Russia trying to break the blockade of Cuba. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. Also, if you found this episode interesting or useful, you can support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation or by subscribing as a paid or sponsor using the links and details in the description of this video. There are a variety of platforms there, and I'm sure you'll be able to choose the one that suits you best. I would appreciate any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.